do that. Yes, I'm Michael Fearon. My memories of the war are still quite extensive, because I was just 10 years old when the war broke out, and Filey had a very special place really in wartime memories because of its location on the coast. Well, it's nice to have you all here this morning to give me the opportunity of remembering events of past years. I remember the war quite well, actually, because I was exactly 10 years old when the war broke out. And of course, I lived in Filey, and if I stand in that room in the window there, I can actually see the house where I was born in, and the house where I spent most of my early years. So I'm familiar with Filey, particularly this area. Filey was affected in several additional ways to what virtually every other place in England was affected by the war. The war broke out in September, of course, 1939, just at the end of the holiday season. And so the reasons for which Filey was additionally affected by the war was the fact, first of all, that it was on the east coast, and it was therefore feared that almost as soon as the war broke out, the nearest places to Europe would be seriously affected by bombs. And so several things happened very quickly. First of all, through August 1939, all the people who were in Filey on holiday obviously curtailed their holidays, or they just didn't come. So suddenly Filey became a place with quite a lot of boarding houses and hotels, but the people were moving away. But of course, at the same time, a lot of men and women were being called up for the war, and the established military camps weren't sufficiently large in number to accommodate all the men and women who were being called up, and therefore they looked around for places where they could accommodate them. And of course, places like Filey and Scarborough and Bridlington had quite a lot of boarding houses and hotels where suddenly they didn't have people staying there. So they moved a huge number of military forces into Filey because of the Crescent Hotel and the White Lodge and all the other small hotels that Filey had. And so Filey changed very quickly from being a nice select holiday resort to being a garrison town. And so that was one of the reasons. Another reason why Filey changed as well was that evacuees suddenly arrived in quite large numbers, and it was very well organised. The evacuee system was very well organised, and probably David remembers that the evacuees that came to Filey were in the main, were from either Hull or West Hartlepool. And so, quite surprisingly, for a town with a population of less than 4,000, Filey received 1,300 evacuees. Quite surprising, really. So that was suddenly Filey had literally hundreds and hundreds of young people from Hull or West Hartlepool. And as I say, it was extremely well organised because they feared that as soon as the war broke out, cities particularly would be bombed quite heavily. And so they thought, whatever we do, we've got to do it quickly. And they did, and they very well organised indeed. And so I, at the time, lived just across the road. Well, we had two evacuees from West Hartlepool. And my mother was in the Women's Voluntary Service, and one of her jobs was to go up to the railway station collect a little group of children and bring them down into Filey and deposit them, not quite literally on people's doorsteps, but how it was organised I'm not sure. But they encouraged people, of course, to take evacuees, because suddenly they had to accommodate them all, which they did. If you had one evacuee, you did get paid. You got paid 8 shillings a week for each evacuee, for one evacuee. If you had 2 evacuees, you got 14 shillings. And if you had 3 evacuees, you got £1 a week, which wasn't very much, of course, but was just about adequate to cover the basic costs of suddenly having extra young people that you had to look after. So that was the evacuees. Nothing very much happened in the excuse me, in the first few weeks of the war, because Hitler never wanted to go to war with England. And in the museum, Victoria will have seen it probably, we have a leaflet that had been dropped on England, which formed a letter from Hitler, in which he says, I never wanted to go to war with Britain, because it was Britain that declared war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on Britain. Sometimes Chamberlain is criticised for not declaring war in 1938. But if he had have done, because he was then the Prime Minister, if he had have done, it would have been extremely foolish, because militarily speaking, Germany was 4 times as strong as Britain. They had 4 times as many men under arms, 4 times as many tanks and aircraft, etc. And so if Britain had declared war on Germany in 1938, it wouldn't have taken Germany very long, as long as they could have got across the Channel to take over Britain. And so the delay of 1 year did at least enable Britain to go some way towards rearming and recruiting forces. So that in 1939 then, when Germany actually invaded Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. Now why? And the answer is that, of course, Britain and Poland had a mutual defence agreement, I think, that if one was attacked, the other would come to his defence. But this was quite remarkable, because there was virtually no economic or sociological links between Poland and Britain. So why did Britain embark upon an arrangement with Poland? Because nobody in Britain in those days would have any reason to go to Poland, or would have any relations or friends there. So that was quite a surprise. But they did. They declared war on Germany, and you will have heard the recording of Chamberlain saying that they'd got in touch with Germany to say, withdraw from Poland, and if you don't, we'll declare war. And Chamberlain says, as you will know, they have not done that. So therefore, we are at war with Germany. And people accepted it. It was strange how they just accepted it. Nobody, I mean, today, if something like that happened, half the country would be up in arms with marches and campaigns and all sorts of things. But in those days, people said, oh, we're at war with Germany. Oh, well, let's do what we have to do. So one of the first jobs that particularly the women would do would be search the shops for blackout material to make blackout curtains, because of course air raid precautions were immediately introduced, and so that you were not allowed to show any chink of light at all. Suddenly all the street lamps went out, and very fortunately in some respects the war broke out at a time when we had light nights and light mornings, so you could just about manage without any form of light in the house at all. If it had happened in say December, when it got dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, perhaps it would have been quite serious. But that was one of the first jobs that women did, to look for material from which they could make blackout curtains. And David might remember, if you wanted material, where did you go? If you lived in Filey and you wanted material, where did you go?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it's somewhere down Queen Street.
Well, that would be one of the places. But if you wanted a lot, you would go to the Rem. Now, where was the Rem?
I don't know.
Yes, you do.
Right?
The Rem was how the Remnant Warehouse was abbreviated. Now, which is the Remnant Warehouse? Boys in Scarborough.
Yeah, right.
Boys in Scarborough, very, very important shop in Scarborough, and still is. But it was always known to Filey women as the Rem, because it was known in those days, in the 30s and 40s, as the Remnant Warehouse. They don't do it quite so much now, but virtually a whole floor of boys would be devoted to material, rolls of material, sheets of material, anything. And so people then descended upon boys in large numbers to buy material to make blackout curtains. So that was one of the immediate changes. Another change, of course, was food. And so, in addition to looking for material for making curtains, you had to acquire a ration book. And again, that was very well organised. And almost immediately, everybody in the country was issued with a ration book. In the museum, we have a drawer for it. Have you seen them,
Yes.
Victoria? Yeah. So we've got lots and lots of ration books. And I sometimes, if I'm in, I never go to Tesco because I get lost in Tesco. So Tesco in Filey is much too big for me. But I go in Spar, and I can cope with Spar because it's simple. But sometimes if I'm in Spar, in a little queue to pay for what I bought, and immediately they whip things past the reader, and within seconds have told you how much you owe them. But in the days of ration books, first of all, you couldn't go to any shop you wanted. You had to be registered with a particular shop. And in Filey, there were probably about at least half a dozen grocers' shops. There were 2 or 3 in Queen Street for a start. And then there were others. There was Cyril Horner's, you might just remember, David. And there was Rhodes, of course, and Cambridge and Brown's, I think, opposite the post office. Filey had quite a lot of grocers' shops, and so everybody had to register with a particular shop. You couldn't just drop into a grocer's shop and buy something. And if you bought something, then with your money you had to give them your ration book, and the shopkeeper or shop assistant with a pair of scissors would very carefully cut out a tiny square. If you bought a pound of sugar, you had to cut out a tiny square. So it would be totally impossible today, because we're now so accustomed to things being whipped past a cash register. So that was another thing that you had to cope with in those early days of the war, to cope with the ration book system. The other, I mentioned about the evacuees coming to Filey. Filey had something like, I could give you the exact number perhaps, because again that was quite a remarkable story. Filey had 1,312 evacuees.
Crumbs.
Yes, but of course, the first few weeks of the war are sometimes described as a phony war because nothing happened. We were anticipating lots and lots of air raids. They didn't occur. The British Expeditionary Force went to France, but no really serious fighting took place for quite a long time. And so within 6 weeks, exactly half of the evacuees had gone home. We had 2 evacuees excuse me, from West Hartlepool, but after 6 weeks or so, the mother of the 2 children we had came and asked my mother if she could accommodate another one, because there was a brother elsewhere in Filey, but he wasn't very settled. So the mother asked my mother if she could accommodate another one, and my mother said, well, no, she was full, because there was me and my sister and her grandfather and 2 evacuees, and so there just wasn't any more room. So the mother said, okay, I'll take them home. So she came in a taxi from West Hartlepool and took them all home. And so that was our experience of evacuees coming to an end. So that was another thing that Filey differed. So it was now within a week or 2 of the outbreak of war, it became a garrison town with hundreds and hundreds of troops, and also hundreds and hundreds of evacuees as well. So Filey did not suffer very much from air raids. Nobody was killed in Filey as a result of an air raid. 1 or 2 people were injured as a result. In fact, we had staying with us just the other day one of the people who was slightly injured as a result of an air raid. David might remember, do you remember Arthur Randall, who was head at the council school?
Randall.
Randall.
Arthur Randall, yes.
Arthur Randall.
Yes.
Well, Arthur Randall came with his family from West Hartlepool, and he was a teacher. And so almost immediately he got a job teaching at the council school, and very soon the then head retired, and Arthur Randall got the job as head. So he was an evacuee, but he became head of the council school. And one of his family, Kath Randall, is a contemporary of Anne's, and they've remained in touch and friends ever since. And in fact, Kath came to stay with us just a week or 2 ago for a little while, and at the time she and her family were living in a flat in Rutland Street, and an incendiary bomb dropped and went straight through the roof and straight through their flat, and slightly injured Kath on its way. So we did have quite a few incendiaries, but not many bombs. The biggest bomb to drop on Filey, actually, I went to look at soon after it had fallen, and it fell in the garden of Tower Cottage, and made a huge crater. So much so that then Miss Clay, who lived there, the following morning, it blew all the windows out, and a lot of the windows in the houses on West Avenue. But the Crescent Hotel was then occupied by troops, and one of the military personnel came round to the house to see if they were all right. And Miss Clay said, yes, but would you have a look down the crater to see if there's anything still waiting to explode down there? So he had to get a ladder to take him down this crater. It was as deep as that, so it really was a big crater, and it was just in front of the house. If the bomb had fallen 20 feet to the north, it would have demolished the house, but very fortunately it didn't. So they filled in the crater, and that was it. So there were a few other bombs around Filey, but not many. The biggest fire as a result of incendiary bombs was the laundry. You remember the laundry, because David, on Laundry Road, Victoria, the laundry was just at the right hand side of Laundry Road as you go down the road. It is now converted into all sorts of industrial units. But an incendiary bomb dropped on that. I was in the Briggs Cinema at the time, and suddenly the film stopped, and they said, "Oh, we've had an air raid," and so we all poured out of the cinema. You know where the Briggs Cinema is, do you?
Yes.
We all poured out of the Briggs Cinema and said, "Laundry's on fire," and it was. It was quite a serious fire, so that was the major fire. There were a few other events. There were a few bombs dropped around, and we used to go and collect shrapnel. If a bomb dropped, in the fields round about, we would go and collect shrapnel from it. It was anticipated that they might drop gas bombs, and so if they did, you would go to a gas, what do they call it?
Decontamination.
Decontamination. Take your clothes off and they would hose you down. There are a couple down West Avenue, just in front of Clarence House. Have you seen those?
Yeah.
There are the two houses that I'm referring to. Is it 30 and 32 West Avenue? In front of Clarence House, the garages there are actually decontamination units. And at the end of the war, they had built two units there, one for men, one for women. And at the end of the war, Mr. Cadman from the Yorkshire Bank and can't remember his name, the manager of the post office, they built those two houses, and instead of demolishing the gas cleansing units, they simply converted them into garages. And you can tell because they've got little glass on the roofs, because the gas units did not have windows because they were totally sealed. So you would go in, they would seal the door, and then they would hose you down if you've been contaminated. And so if you have a look at when you go to have a look at Tile Cottage, have a look at those two garages, and you can see the little what they call it at the top to allow light in through the roof. So yeah, there were, I think, is it a couple down
on Brooklands?
On Brooklands are still there, and I've not closely looked at those, but at the right hand side as you go down from West Avenue, am I right? Oh, South Dean, where they are?
No, it's
it is Rutland. Yes, Rutland Street, that's right. Yeah.
Brooklands?
No, Brooklands, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Brooklands, that's right. So, but I've not looked closely at those, but I think, did they convert those into garages?
I think the garages, yeah. I think that was the main centre for it, because it's a much bigger building compared to the ones up on West.
Yes, for some.
Yeah.
I can remember one particularly, a Wellington bomber that came down in, I think, 1940, coming back from, I think, Hamburg, and he ran very low on fuel as he crossed the North Sea, and then it must have been with a real sense of relief that they spied the coast, as they virtually finished any fuel that they had. And so he landed actually in what is now the school playing fields in Muston Road, and it was a very good landing because all the crew were able to walk out, and they were able to take the aircraft away, repair it, and it flew again, I think. So that, but I do remember going to see the Wellington bomber at the just at the top of Western Road.
Was there many air raid shelters around Fearon? Was there any public air raid shelters, or were they all private?
Yes, no, I think there was one, excuse me, public one. There were one too, on where I think the Spa is built now, between the Midland Bank and excuse me, and the Yorkshire Bank. There was a piece of land that wasn't built on, and I think they built a shelter on that. I lived across the road at the time, and we had a Morrison shelter in the house. The more common form of private area shelter was an Anderson, which would be built if you had a garden and you had the labour. Then you dug a big hole in your garden and put iron over the top, curved iron on it, and all the soil you dug out of the hole you put on top of the roof, and depending upon how much energy you were prepared to expend, you made it as comfortable as possible with probably little seats and probably a bit of duckboard or something to put your feet on, which for the first few weeks it would be reasonable, but of course after a time the word would go around all the cat and dog population that there was a nice place to meet in somebody's garden, and it would get wet and damp, and so an Anderson shelter, unless it had been very, very carefully built, would not be a very pleasant place to sit in if there was an air raid. So I don't think many people would do that. I'm trying to think where the other public shelters were. Can't think at the moment. But yes, there were some.
Okay, thank you. Can you remember the beach defences?
Yes, of course. The threat of invasion, even as far north as Filey, was taken seriously, on the basis that the Germans would, when they were planning an invasion, they would say, well, the obvious place is to invade across the shortest sea route, i.e. near the Channel. But then they would say, well, that is the place where we would be most expected to invade, and so we'll go somewhere else. And so it was quite a serious possibility that they would invade even as far north as Filey. So sea defences were very important for two things. First of all, for perhaps boats, coming from bigger boats probably out in the sea, but also aircraft landing, because Filey Beach was in many respects an ideal place as a landing ground. In fact, in 1910 there were only two places in the whole of Yorkshire, I think, where aircraft could land and take off. One was Doncaster Racecourse, and the other was Filey Beach. And so it was taken very seriously that aircraft might land on the beach. And so, do you remember the lines of concrete blocks, David, that went from the promenade and the cliffs straight out into the water?
Only after the war.
There are still some left. At the end of the war they demolished them all except for a few in the vicinity of Reeton Gap. Have you seen them?
Yes.
They're now in a bad state of repair, of course, because they've been there 70 odd years. But the concrete blocks were about that square, about that high, and they would build a line of them very close together from the cliffs or the cliffs or the promenade straight out into low water. And so around the Filey Bay there would probably be about 5 or 6 of these, and then others as well where they thought they would be most useful. And so those were concrete blocks. After the war they did demolish almost all of them. But that, and they also built various forms of ironwork at different particular times. I'm not quite sure why, but suddenly they would build, like scaffolding on the beach, again to prevent boats and aircraft making use of the beach. So yes, you were not allowed to go on the beach, because one of the first things that people were encouraged to do as soon as war broke out, with air raids in mind, was to surround your house with sandbags. And you will have seen lots and lots of photographs from programs like Dad's Army and that kind of thing, where doorways and windows were protected with great piles of sandbags. And so Fearon was fortunate in that respect, that there was more sand than you could ever possibly need straight on the beach. Whereas if you grew up, say, in somewhere like Sheffield, I don't know what they would do there. There would be sand pits and things that you could use. But in Filey, of course, you just went down on the beach, filled your sandbags. But as soon as you'd done that, they'd say, don't bother coming back anymore, because we're closing the beach. And so, particularly for young people like myself then, you might have a really nice hot summer's day and the beach would be totally deserted because you weren't allowed to go on it. And that happened because for 2 or 3 years. The reason being, of course, is that not only had they built these sea defences on the beach, but they also had filled the cliffs with explosives, so that if troops did invade and started climbing up the cliffs, they would probably tread on what do they call them?
The mines.
Mines, that's right. Landmines, that's right. And so the cliffs were full of landmines. So it would be dangerous for people to go on the beach and just say, oh, well, let's just climb up the cliff because of the landmines. So yes, sea defences were extremely important. I don't know a lot about the Home Guard, but yes, Fearon did have its particular unit. I think that they used the gas. What did you call it? The gas showrooms. You won't remember the gas showrooms. You will remember the gas showrooms, yes, David. It's now just a patch of open ground, and has it got a for sale notice on when you come out of the bus station, or just adjacent to the surgery, there's a patch of open ground before you get to the access road for the railway station. And the gas showrooms, which was quite a fine building actually, was built on that. And I think the Home Guard used the first floor. I think, I'm not absolutely sure about that, but there was a billiard table up there as well, and I think they used it for that.
Mm-hmm.
Tile Cottage actually, that we've just been talking about, as part of the outbuildings, there was a stabling for 4 horses, and adjacent to those there was a little a room that they called the coachman's cottage. He didn't actually live there, I don't think, but I think if he had a sick horse, I think he probably stayed the night there. And in that little room there were still the pegs with the names of the Home Guard, because I think they used that outbuilding as well as a meeting place, because under the coat pegs there were the names of many of the members of the Home Guard, some of whom I knew at the time.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.